The summer of 1940 was one of the darkest moments in British history. Nazi Germany had already crushed much of Europe with terrifying speed. Poland had fallen, Denmark and Norway had collapsed, the Netherlands and Belgium had been overrun, and France, once considered one of the strongest military powers in Europe, had surrendered in a matter of weeks. Adolf Hitler now controlled nearly the entire Western continent. Only one major nation still stood against him: Britain. Across the English Channel, German forces prepared for what many believed would be the final blow of the war in Western Europe. Hitler's plan was clear: Britain would be invaded, defeated, and forced into submission. The operation was given a chilling name: Operation Sea Lion. If successful, German troops would cross the Channel, land on British shores, and destroy the last resistance to Nazi rule in Europe. But before any invasion could begin, Germany had one crucial task. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. Without control of the skies, German invasion ships would be vulnerable to attack. Hitler and his commanders understood that air superiority was the key to victory. If the RAF could be wiped out, Britain would have no way to stop the invasion fleet. The stage was set for one of the most critical battles of the entire war, the Battle of Britain. At the center of Britain's defense stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command. Dowding had spent years preparing for a conflict that many others had underestimated. He built a revolutionary defense network that combined radar stations, ground observers, communication centers, and fighter squadrons into a coordinated system that could detect and intercept enemy aircraft before they reached their targets. This system, known as the Dowding system, would become one of Britain's greatest advantages. Radar stations along the British coast scanned the skies for incoming enemy aircraft. When German bombers crossed the Channel, radar operators could detect them while they were still miles away. Information was quickly passed to command centers, where controllers directed RAF fighters to intercept the enemy. For the first time in history, a nation could see an air attack coming before the planes were even visible. But despite these advantages, the situation remained desperate. Germany possessed a far larger air force. The Luftwaffe had thousands of aircraft and experienced pilots who had already proven themselves in battles across Europe. Britain, by contrast, was dangerously short on both planes and trained pilots. Every aircraft mattered. Every pilot mattered. Many of the young men flying for the RAF were barely out of training. Some had fewer than 10 hours of combat experience, yet they were about to face the most powerful air force in the world. Throughout July and early August 1940, the Luftwaffe began launching increasing numbers of raids against British shipping and coastal targets. These attacks were designed to lure RAF fighters into battle and wear them down. Day after day, British pilots scrambled into the sky to intercept incoming German bombers and fighters. The fighting was fierce and relentless. German Messerschmitt fighters clashed with British Spitfires and Hurricanes in swirling dogfights above the Channel and the English countryside. Bombers attempted to strike radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The goal was simple: destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. As the weeks passed, the pressure on Fighter Command grew more intense. RAF airfields were bombed repeatedly, hangars burned, runways were cratered, and aircraft were destroyed before they could even take off. Pilots flew multiple missions each day, often returning to the air only minutes after landing. Exhaustion became a constant companion. The battle was becoming a war of attrition. If Britain lost too many fighters or too many pilots, the defense would collapse. German bombers would roam freely across the skies, and invasion would soon follow. Then came a day that would change everything. August 18th, 1940. It would later become known as the hardest day. From the early hours of the morning, radar stations detected massive German formations assembling across the channel. Hundreds of aircraft prepared to launch in coordinated waves. The Luftwaffe planned to strike key RAF airfields and radar installations in southern England. If the attack succeeded, Fighter Command might not survive. At dawn, the first German bombers lifted into the sky, escorted by swarms of fighters. Their engines roared as they crossed the channel toward Britain. Radar stations quickly detected the incoming formations. Within minutes, the alert was sent through the defense network. Telephones rang in command centers. Controllers studied maps covered with moving markers that represented enemy aircraft. Orders were issued rapidly. Scramble the fighters. Across southern England, RAF pilots ran to their aircraft. Ground crews pulled away wheel chocks as engines roared to life. Hurricanes and Spitfires raced down runways and climbed into the sky. They were flying directly into one of the largest air battles Britain had ever seen. Wave after wave of German aircraft approached the British coast. Bombers targeted radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. Fighters attempted to protect them while engaging RAF interceptors. The sky became a chaotic battlefield. Dogfights erupted everywhere. British fighters dived through bomber formations, firing bursts of machine gun fire that tore through wings and fuselages. German escorts counterattacked, chasing RAF pilots through tight turns and steep dives. Smoke trails spiraled across the sky as damaged aircraft plunged toward the ground. Airfields such as Kenley, Biggin Hill, and Tangmere came under heavy attack. Bombs exploded across runways and buildings. Hangars collapsed in flames. At one point, the situation seemed almost hopeless. German bombers appeared in overwhelming numbers. Several RAF bases were badly damaged. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Pilots were killed or wounded. The Luftwaffe believed victory was within reach. But something remarkable happened during the next 13 hours. Despite the relentless attacks, Britain's defense system continued to function. Radar stations that were damaged were quickly repaired. Fighter squadrons were redirected from quieter sectors to reinforce areas under heavy assault. Pilots who had already flown multiple missions climbed back into the air again. The dowding system allowed Britain to concentrate its limited resources exactly where they were needed most. Instead of wasting fighters on empty skies, controllers guided them directly toward incoming enemy formations. This efficiency meant that the RAF could fight with far fewer aircraft than Germany expected. Throughout the day, German formations were intercepted again and again. Hurricanes proved especially effective against bombers. Their 8 machine guns could rip through the relatively slow and vulnerable German aircraft. Meanwhile, the faster Spitfires engaged the escorting Messerschmitt fighters. It was a carefully balanced strategy. One squadron after another entered the fight. Pilots chased enemy bombers across the countryside, firing until their ammunition was gone before racing back to base to refuel and rearm. Ground crews worked frantically to prepare aircraft for the next sortie. The cycle repeated over and over again. Meanwhile, German losses continued to rise. Bombers that survived the first attacks found themselves intercepted again on the return journey across the channel. Damaged aircraft struggled to stay airborne. Some crashed into the sea before reaching safety. Others limped back to their bases riddled with bullet holes. By late afternoon, the scale of the battle had become clear. Hundreds of aircraft had been involved. The skies above southern England were littered with wreckage and parachutes. But the RAF was still fighting. Despite the destruction at several airfields, Britain's fighter force had not collapsed. Radar stations continued to track incoming aircraft. Squadrons continued to scramble. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy Fighter Command. Those 13 hours of relentless combat had pushed Britain to the very edge, but the defense had held. For Germany, the day had been far more costly than expected. The Luftwaffe lost dozens of aircraft and many experienced air crews. The damage inflicted on RAF infrastructure, while serious, was not enough to cripple the defense system. It was a turning point. The German High Command began to realize that defeating the RAF might not be as easy as they had believed. In the weeks that followed, the Luftwaffe changed its strategy. Instead of focusing primarily on RAF airfields, German bombers began attacking British cities in what became known as the Blitz. This decision would prove to be one of the most important strategic mistakes of the war. By shifting attention away from fighter command, Germany gave the RAF time to recover, repair damaged bases, and As evening approached on that brutal day in August 1940, the skies above southern England slowly began to quiet. Smoke from burning aircraft drifted across the countryside, and the roar of engines that had filled the air for hours began to fade. For the exhausted pilots of the Royal Air Force, the battle had been relentless. Many had flown 4 or 5 missions in a single day, pushing both themselves and their aircraft to the absolute limit. When they finally landed, some pilots were so tired they could barely climb out of their cockpits. Ground crews rushed forward, helping them down, while mechanics immediately began inspecting the battered fighters. Runways were scarred with bomb craters. Several airfields had suffered severe damage. Buildings were burning, fuel dumps had exploded, and ambulances moved constantly between the flight lines and field hospitals. Yet despite the destruction, something remarkable had happened. Fighter Command was still operational. The defense network that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had created had survived one of the most intense attacks of the entire war. The Luftwaffe, however, had expected a very different result. German commanders believed the attacks would shatter Britain's defenses. Their bombers had struck airfields repeatedly, and many pilots reported seeing fires and destruction on the ground. From their perspective, it seemed certain that the RAF had suffered devastating losses. Some German intelligence officers even reported that British fighter strength was nearing collapse. But those reports were dangerously inaccurate. The British system of rapid repair and aircraft dispersal meant that many damaged airfields were back in operation within hours. Craters were quickly filled, temporary runways were prepared, and surviving aircraft were moved to secondary locations when necessary. Even when airfields were badly damaged, nearby bases could absorb the extra squadrons. This flexibility allowed Fighter Command to keep fighting even under heavy pressure. Throughout the night following the massive battle, mechanics worked under floodlights repairing damaged aircraft. Bullet holes were patched, engines were replaced, and new ammunition belts were loaded into the wings of Hurricanes and Spitfires. Pilots who had survived the day tried to get some rest, knowing that the next morning might bring another wave of attacks. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, German commanders held their own meetings to evaluate the results of the day's fighting. They knew the battle had been intense. Reports confirmed that many German aircraft had been shot down. Several experienced bomber crews were missing, and some fighter squadrons had lost multiple pilots. Yet the Luftwaffe still believed that Britain was close to defeat. Their intelligence suggested that the RAF had suffered even heavier losses. In reality, the situation was far more balanced than Germany realized. Britain had lost aircraft and pilots, but its production factories continued to build new fighters at an impressive rate. Aircraft factories across the country were turning out Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than Germany expected. Replacement pilots were also being trained and rushed into squadrons. This steady flow of reinforcements kept Fighter Command alive during the most dangerous weeks of the battle. Another factor that Germany underestimated was the resilience of the British people. Air raids were becoming a regular part of daily life. Sirens wailed across cities and towns as enemy bombers approached. Families rushed into underground shelters or crowded into subway stations to escape the bombs. Despite the fear and destruction, public morale remained surprisingly strong. Radio broadcasts and newspapers celebrated the bravery of RAF pilots. Stories of daring dogfights and miraculous escapes spread quickly. Photographs of young fighter pilots, many barely in their 20s, appeared across the country. They became symbols of resistance, representing the determination of Britain to continue the fight no matter the cost. This growing legend of the RAF helped unite the nation during one of its most dangerous moments. But the battle in the skies was far from over. In the weeks following the massive clashes of mid-August, the Luftwaffe intensified its campaign against Fighter Command. German bombers continued targeting RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The goal remained the same: destroy the RAF and clear the way for invasion. The pressure on British defenses grew even more severe. Some airfields were attacked multiple times in a single week. Pilots often found themselves taking off while bombs were still exploding nearby. In several cases, squadrons had to relocate to different bases after their airfields became unusable. Losses continued on both sides. Young RAF pilots were killed in combat almost every day. Some aircraft disappeared into clouds and never returned. Others were shot down in flames during desperate dogfights with German fighters. Each loss was deeply felt within the squadrons, where pilots often formed close friendships while sharing the dangers of combat. Yet even under these conditions, the British defense held. Part of the reason was the strategic decisions made by Air Chief Marshal Dowding and his commanders. Instead of throwing every fighter into battle at once, they carefully managed their resources. Squadrons were rotated in and out of the most intense fighting sectors, allowing exhausted pilots brief periods of rest. This careful management helped prevent the total collapse that Germany was hoping to achieve. Then, in early September 1940, a critical shift occurred. Frustrated by the RAF's continued resistance, German leadership decided to change tactics. Instead of focusing primarily on RAF airfields and radar stations, the Luftwaffe began targeting major British cities. London became the main objective. The massive bombing campaign that followed would be known as the Blitz. Night after night, German bombers crossed the Channel and dropped thousands of bombs on London and other cities. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Fires burned across the capital, and thousands of civilians were killed or injured. Despite the fear and destruction, strategically, it provided an unexpected advantage for Britain. By redirecting their attacks toward cities, the Germans reduced the pressure on Fighter Command's airfields and radar network. The RAF suddenly had breathing room to repair damaged bases, reorganize squadrons, and train additional pilots. This steady flow of reinforcements kept Fighter Command alive during the most dangerous weeks of the battle. By October 1940, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. British fighters were still defending the skies, and radar stations continued to provide early warning of incoming raids. Without control of the air, the planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, became far too dangerous to attempt. German leaders quietly postponed the operation. Eventually, the invasion was abandoned altogether. The 13 hours of desperate fighting that had helped save Britain were now part of a much larger story. The Battle of Britain had become the first major defeat for Nazi Germany during the Second World War. For the first time, Hitler's forces had been stopped. The consequences of that victory were enormous. Because Britain remained free, it became the central base for Allied resistance in Western Europe. American supplies flowed into British ports. Allied air forces launched bombing campaigns against German industry. And years later, British shores would become the launching point for the massive invasion that liberated France. The survival of Britain in 1940 made all of that possible. Historians often debate which moments of the Second World War were the most decisive. Some point to battles on the Eastern Front, others to naval clashes in the Pacific. Yet many agree that the Battle of Britain and the critical hours when the RAF nearly collapsed but ultimately held was one of the most important turning points of the entire conflict. Those 13 hours were more than just a battle. They were a test of courage, endurance, and determination. Young pilots climbed into fragile aircraft and faced overwhelming odds. Radar operators stared at glowing screens tracking enemy formations as they approached the coast. Mechanics worked through the night repairing machines that would be back in combat within hours. Together, they formed a defense that proved stronger than Germany expected. When the smoke cleared and the Luftwaffe withdrew, Britain still stood. And because Britain survived, the war would eventually take a very different course. The skies above southern England had witnessed one of the most important struggles in modern history. A struggle that lasted just 13 hours, but helped shape the